Okay, at the top of the hour, we'll start. Hello, I'm Carla Treloran from the Centre for Social Research in Health. I'm joining today from Bidjigal land, and I pay respects to the traditional custodians of these lands and all the traditional custodians of the lands you all are joining from, and acknowledge the ongoing connection to land, water and culture that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have had for 60,000 years and more in this country. So welcome to our first Spotlight on Stigma session for 2025. And some of you may have also attended our Tackling Stigma in Healthcare conference last year. And what we really learnt there was the power of bringing together expertise from very different settings and having us talk together as a group to learn from each other. So that's what we've tried to do in this session, and you'll hear some incredible points of view. So we're also interested in ideas or suggestions that you might have, so please feel free to drop them in the chat or send me an email afterwards where you think there are great areas of expertise that we all could learn from. We had more than 250 people register for this session today, so I'm sure more people will join us and pick up the recordings afterwards. So hello to those people who are joining afterwards. So I'm going to hand over to my excellent colleague, Eleanor Karma, to set us up for the morning. Over to you, Eleanor.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Eleanor. I'm also at the Centre for Social Research and Health as part of the Stigma team. And I'm really pleased to introduce the two speakers that we have today. Today's topic is focusing on organisational approaches to stigma reduction with a particular focus on disability and LGBTQI people. So I'd like to introduce Yana Rodgers, who is a professor in the Department of Labour Studies and Employment Relations in the School of Management and Labour Relations at Rodgers University, and Michael Woodhouse, who is CEO of ACON with over 20 years of experience while working in the health and human services sector in both government and not-for-profit. So just to note how today is run, so Yana will speak first, will present, followed by Michael, and then we've got some time for questions at the end. So feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end today. Over to you, Yana.
Well, thank you very much, Eleanor, for that very nice introduction. And both to you, Carla and Eleanor, for hosting me today. And by way of backdrop, let me see, slideshow from the beginning. I met Carla back in September when I was visiting UNSW for a couple of weeks on my research sabbatical, looking at the economics of stigma. And she suggested that I speak in the seminar, and I welcomed the suggestion. So I am approaching the talk today as an economist, looking at workplace approaches to stigma reduction. And as an economist, the perspective that I bring to stigma is that entire countries are bearing the economic costs of social stigma. We may hear and experience a lot of individuals being directly impacted by social stigma and bearing the personal cost, but entire countries do bear an economic cost. And we'll focus today on two groups that have faced stigma all over the globe and continue to do so, people with disabilities, as well as LGBTQ plus individuals. And we see that stigma within their own families, within schools, communities, in the labor market, as well as in access to healthcare. And these problems with stigma contribute to poor health outcomes, but those poor health outcomes in turn also have economic repercussions. And this is some of the work that I am doing as an economist, looking quantitatively at what are the effects of stigma on reductions in workplace productivity, lower labor force participation, increases in how much governments are spending on public health, as well as even, and we'll talk about this today, lower growth of GDP or gross domestic product. So what I'd like to do in my 25 minutes today, it's not a lot of time, is give you a couple of very quick snapshots of two research projects that I have going on stigma. One is on stigma faced by people with disabilities, and the other one is stigma faced specifically by transgender youth. And the second part of the talk will look at workplace interventions that can reduce stigma and also improve the perceptions that marginalized and stigmatized individuals have of their experience at work. And finally, what are some of these gains for the macro economy from having interventions that improve inclusion? So let me give you just a couple of very quick snapshots. And the first is some current research. This is taking the form of two working papers that are being submitted for journals on disability and the stigma faced by people with disabilities in the workplace. And what we did was conduct an original survey of healthcare workers in a large statewide university healthcare system. And we have almost 1,000 people who took the survey. And of that 1,000 person sample, 228 people identified as having a disability and the others did not. And about half of those people who said on the survey that they have a disability indicated that they have disclosed their disability to their employer, and the remainder either have no disability or they did not disclose, or they said it's complicated. So we have lots of results from this survey, but the few results that I'd like to just highlight is that of the people who reported having a disability, the most common impairment is difficulty concentrating or making decisions. And then the next most common disability was with mobility. And the question asked about walking or climbing stairs. And I do want to note that difficulty concentrating or making decisions is also one of the most common impairments of long COVID. And that's another area of my research showing that people are increasingly reporting that specific kind of impairment as a result of long COVID. Our survey showed that about half of employees have disclosed their impairment to their employer, and about 17% of people with disabilities are afraid of being stigmatized. So here is a table from just one of our papers, and you can see in detail the responses and the questions that we asked. About 15% of people with disabilities said that they've sometimes been treated unfairly because of their health condition. Again, about 15% of people said they feel socially isolated because of their health condition or their impairment, and 17% did not disclose because they said they are afraid of being stigmatized. We did some regression work, some statistical work, and our results showed that people who do have a disability have much more negative work experiences and perceptions of those work experiences. So we asked a battery of questions in different categories related to work experience and job satisfaction. And some of these measures included how committed people feel to their organization and how they perceive their organization to support them. They also answered questions about their perceptions of how open their employer is to differences and their employer's climate for inclusion. And they answered questions about their relationships with their managers and their colleagues. And consistently, and these results are statistically significant, people with disabilities have worse perceptions and worse experiences in these different categories of, let's call it work experience, compared to people without disabilities. But when we looked at the impact of being fully granted an accommodation, in almost all cases, that negative association between disability and work experience is no longer statistically significant. So that's one brief snapshot of a pretty big research project on stigma and disability. I'd like to give you next another quick snapshot on a series of papers that have very recently been published on stigma faced by transgender youth. And there's so many reasons to care about this, but I think one of the biggest reasons that we should care about the mental health of transgender youth is that they have a much higher likelihood of attempting suicide. This is a chart from one of our research papers showing that transgender youth with living in families where their parents are not very supportive, where they've actually shown hostile behaviors, they are about 8 times more likely to attempt suicide by the time they're age 18 compared to cisgender youth. Transgender youth with neutral family environments have a slightly lower likelihood of attempting suicide, but it's still much higher than cisgender youth. And similarly for supportive families. And I'll get back to those different levels of family support momentarily. In one of our papers, we looked at 2 kinds of interventions and estimated the causal impact on 2 indicators of mental health. The first is attempting suicide, and the second is running away. And we saw that when transgender youth are exposed to conversion therapy, and this is when a healthcare worker of some kind or religious advisor or a counselor tries to convert a trans identifying youth to going back to identifying to their sex at birth, that leads to a substantially large increase in the risk of attempting suicide and in the risk of running away. However, the other kind of intervention that we looked at is access to hormone replacement therapy. And when trans youth have access to this kind of gender affirming healthcare, that has a significant negative effect on the likelihood of attempting suicide or running away. So in our research papers on trans youth and the stigma that they face, we conclude that access to gender affirming care and specifically hormone replacement therapy reduces the risk of suicide, whereas being forced to go to conversion therapy, that increases the risk of suicide or running away. In another research paper, we looked at when trans youth go through different gender identity milestones, like first coming out to a family member or first identifying as being trans, that does increase the risk of these outcomes. But if the youth are living in supportive families, that mitigates the risk, while unsupportive families exacerbate the risk. So one of the main things we conclude from this research is that it's incredibly important to support transgender youth by affirming their identity, their gender identity. Things like using the correct pronouns, the names that they choose, helping them with clothing and so forth. And conversion therapy is downright dangerous. What we need more of and what we're doing next is looking at the effects of school and workplace interventions on the mental health of LGBT individuals. So that's just a very brief summary of a couple of research projects that I've been working on. I'd like next to switch gears and look at some workplace interventions that can reduce stigma and improve work experiences. So as I mentioned, our statistical research did show that individuals who are fully granted an accommodation can have more positive kinds of job experience, especially people with disabilities. We did some other tests looking at being able to work from home and found that that helps everybody. It helps people both with and without disabilities, but it especially helped people without disabilities. So we think that, work from home, to have that option is important, but a potential downside is that it may reinforce some social isolation that people with disabilities face. When they work from home, they may have fewer options to interact, they have less visibility, and there's less opportunity for networking. So those kind of issues need to be addressed when people work from home. So we do conclude it's important to have accommodations instead of simply pigeonholing people with disabilities into a traditional workspace. And we need to ensure that reasonable accommodations are available for employees who have disabilities and mental health conditions. So I'll go through a number of examples momentarily, but things like flexible work hours, and for folks with hearing and visual impairments, assistive technologies like screen readers, voice recognition software, screen magnifiers, closed captioning. Now, these are some examples of assistive technologies that can help as a reasonable accommodation, and also improving the accessibility of facilities. And in cases when employees with or without disabilities are working from home, employers should try to take steps to decrease the social isolation that they are facing. Examples include more online supervisor and coworker interactions, more virtual social events, and some occasional in-person events that are accessible. So now I'd like to turn to some more examples of specific kinds of accommodations employers can make, more interventions. And I've put these into 4 different buckets. And I'm hoping that Michael will have more examples, or people on the call, additional examples, or possibly even additional categories of interventions. But the first bucket, let's put those in education and awareness programs. So things like training sessions for educating employees about stigma, the impact of stigma, and how to fight it. And there's 2 programs that I learned about in the US, in doing my research and also preparing for the seminar today. These programs are called Mental Health First Aid and Just 5. And these have been cited in the literature as having some positive effects on reducing stigma around mental health, as well as substance use disorders. And when employers have workshops and seminars, it's important to have those. They can invite experts to talk about stigma, and also opportunities to share personal stories. It really helps to humanize the issues and foster empathy among employees. Another bucket of workplace interventions is a bucket I call inclusion policies and practices. So non-discrimination policies, these need to be on the books. They also need to be enforced in order to protect individuals against stigma, related to all kinds of things, including the 2 topics today, disabilities and LGBTQ individuals. More inclusive recruitment practices. Now, some of this may be, speaking of technologies, new technologies, often now we're using algorithms and AI in recruitment, and that can potentially help if the algorithms are focused on skills rather than, demographic characteristics. but other practices like implementing blind recruitment processes, hiring panels that are diverse, as well as outreach programs. Mentorship programs can help, as well as providing opportunities for employees to give feedback in an anonymous way about experiences and concerns they might have related to stigma and discrimination. The third bucket of kinds of accommodations is support programs. These can be employee resource groups, and these are employee-led groups that focus on specific demographics, but also peer support programs to provide emotional and practical support through individualized interactions and trained peer supporters. And the PSPs focus more on personal as well as work-related issues. So things like work-life balance, stress, mental health challenges. I think one example that I'm a part of now is we have a PSP in the American Economics Association for women, who are economics is known to have a very chilly climate for women. And a committee that I'm on for the economics, the status of women in the economics profession, we have a new PSP for women in order to improve the inclusion of women in the economics profession. So that's one example that I'm a part of. And then things like employee assistance programs to ensure that people have access to mental health resources, as well as counseling services and mental health days. And finally, leadership and culture, the fourth bucket. So it's important to have visible leadership support. Leaders do need to be openly supportive at any kind of initiatives that reduce stigma. And they can also share their own experiences. It's important to have a psychologically safe environment where people feel comfortable discussing their challenges without fearing retaliation or judgment. And finally, encouraging the use of non-stigmatizing language in all communications, especially avoiding derogatory terms, but also using person-first language, like a person with a disability instead of a disabled person. So the last part of my talk, and I think I'm on time, is to show you, again, this is from my own research, and the point that I started off the talk with today is that there are gains to society and gains to the whole macroeconomy from greater inclusion. And this is research that I did on greater LGBT inclusion. So what we did in this research paper was to quantify for every country that we could find data on around the world. I think we had data on 160 countries. We quantified 8 different kinds of national legislation related to LGBT inclusion. So here's the 8 kinds of laws that we looked at. So we looked at the legality of same-sex sexual acts, as well as equal age limits, and then prohibition of discrimination in employment, as well as discrimination in goods and services. And then the last 4 laws related to, say, marriage, cohabitation, and adoption. And once we quantified all that, we constructed an index. It was named Gilrow by our co-author. And we compared countries all over the world. And here I looked at the data that we had available. We started with 1966. And by the time we finished the research, we had data up until 2015. So you can see the score of 0 corresponds to a country not having any legal rights, and a score of 8 is when a country had all 8 types of those legal rights. And then I also looked briefly at rights for Australia. So you can see how Australia compares to the world, and the OECD is the rich country club. And overall, there is, no perfect region yet. I think even in our sample, we had no countries, or very, very few, scoring a perfect 8. And you can see the rise over time, and that really didn't start until the 1990s. And Australia is by now slightly ahead of other members of the OECD and quite a bit away from the rest of the world. And looking briefly at, since our data set ended in 2014, some of the changes made in Australia, these are all at the federal level, unless noted where it said subnational. These were changes made at the state level. So by now, I think Australia does have a perfect 8, but at the time we made our data set, it did not. So what we did was a statistical analysis, again, this regression analysis, looking at the association between gross domestic product per capita and this index of legal rights. And we found that controlling for other things, and those other things can also affect GDP per capita. These are population, employment, the capital stock, international trade, and education. When we control for those things, if a country has one additional right on that score of 0 to 8, there is an average increase of GDP per capita of about $2,000. And that amounts to roughly 17% of the average GDP per capita of all the countries in our sample over time that we had. So in my last slide, I'm calling for more research. This is an agenda for me. It's an agenda for other researchers, and for those of you who are pushing for new research, it's really important to have this kind of research showing the effects of DEI policies in the workplace, especially now with the attack on DEI in so many countries, including my own. It's just terrifying to see what's happening to DEI when there already is, such good research showing that DEI works, that inclusion works, that it helps in the workplace, and it helps at the macroeconomic level. I think there's a lot of promising work happening in economics and in psychology and in public health and in sociology, doing field experiments and audit studies that have randomized trials showing that greater inclusion works. And we need more of this kind of, we call it the gold standard, in terms of research that show unambiguous causal effects of these kind of interventions and how they work to reduce stigma. And again, that research is showing that diversity in leadership reduces prejudice and discrimination, that intergroup contact reduces stereotypes, increases empathy, improves relationships, and changes social norms. And also some exciting research I've seen recently is that affirmative action policies do work, and they can have those positive impacts. And with that, I hope I'm on time. I think I am. I will stop, and I look forward to hearing Michael, your comments and your experience, as well as from the rest of the group.
Thanks so much, Yana. That was amazing. And you can see from the chat that everyone thinks this is really important research, and it's really great to see this data. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. And Yana, thank you for that presentation. That was really interesting to walk through all of that research covering so many of these issues. Thank you. Great to be part of this conversation, and thanks Carla and the team for convening it. I'd just like to do a quick acknowledging country. I'm calling in from Gadigal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and respect their ongoing custodianship of land and sea. My name's Michael Woodhouse. I've spent many years working across health and human services, some of that in government, some of that in more operational roles, and I'm really delighted now to be the CEO of this kind of cool organisation I get to lead called ACON. ACON, for those of you who may not know it, is an organisation that was born in the HIV response and is now an organisation that is really committed to how we create people to live healthier and more connected lives, particularly people from of diverse sexualities and genders. We still do a lot of work on HIV, and we'll keep doing that till virtual elimination is achieved and until people living with HIV are all living healthy lives. And we also do a whole lot of work around LGBT health, wellbeing, and inclusion across our community. One of the projects, and one I might keep referencing back to, that we have here is a unit that we call Pride and Diversity. It's a member subscription organisation that we work with large numbers of employers across Australia on LGBTQ inclusion. Trying to work with employers, many of which are quite large employers, about how it is to improve and lift inclusion in their workplace. It's a great program, a program which is actually based in many of the things, I think, Yana, that you've already listed, but trying to instill a behaviour and an approach within those organisations about how we continue to measure, reflect and improve on inclusion and the various strategies can be put in place to make workplaces more inclusive, particularly for LGBTQ people. One of the things I'm really delighted about today is trying to draw some links across multiple people and communities and experiences. One of the things that's run through my career has been working in the disability area. I don't have a disability. I'm not claiming to be a person with disability or disabled person, as I can see that is happening in the chat there, and the language around that is really interesting and important. But I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about that one as well. And I think one of the interesting parallels, I guess, as I was listening to your presentation, Yana, and reading your papers beforehand, was around one of the perhaps things that can be the same for some people with disability and for many LGBT people is actually that disclosure can be a choice. Yeah, not for everybody, but that actually it's possible to get around in the workplace without disclosing quite fundamental parts about yourself, about your identity, about your lived experience, about how it is you move and you are in the world. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep thinking about. My experience would be this always works better in environments where people can be as open and disclose about what's going on for them and their lives and their worlds within their workplace, particularly with frontline managers. And there were some numbers in your work, Yana, which I think particularly seem to bring that out, that those people with disability who were more comfortable and able to disclose actually were having greater satisfaction in their workplace. I don't think that's surprising. Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting thing to keep talking about, because that burden can't be just thrown on people with disability, on LGBT people. It can't just be thrown on the person who might be experiencing stigma and discrimination in the workplace. I think it's an incredibly important responsibility of organisations about how do you create the settings, the environments, the symbols, the behaviours that make it possible for people to be able to be open and have good conversations in their workplace about what is happening in their lives. And I do think that's where the role of many of the things that we've been talking about, but those works around organisational symbols, about marking days of significance, about the posters we have in our workplaces, about making sure we've got a baseline level of knowledge about the language that people use, including some of the debates around that language, so that what we have is a baseline of, I guess, capability, of awareness, in which actually it creates greater and greater safety for people to be able to talk about themselves as full human beings. I think that disclosure question is really important. I'm reminded of a story a colleague told me, just kind of secondhand, but I think it's very interesting, about some work that they had done with a aged care provider, a faith-based aged care provider. they'd been speaking with a client, an older gay man, who had got into the habit of getting rid of photos of himself and his partner. His partner had passed whenever the home care people came in to the organisation. The story I was told that he'd done that because he was worried that would be that there was, concern from workers who were coming in to do cleaning and cooking and assisting him with his daily living. In fact, that wasn't the case. And that when my colleague had let someone quite senior in the organisation know that this was going on for one of their clients, the organisation got onto it straight away, came round, said, "I'm so sorry that you even thought that. It didn't even occur to us that that would be part of our thing. That is never a problem for us. Please tell us about your partner and the things that we'd like to know." I guess I tell that story because I think the lesson there, perhaps for us as organisations and providers, is creating the conditions where actually we've sent the messages that disclosing being yourself is okay. That actually there was something that might have been useful in a welcome pack or something that was needed to say we are delightfully embracing of everybody in all of their lives and their diversity and their human experience. Please, feel free, feel safe, feel open in all of those things. And that maybe that had been the message that client needed to be able to be open and share their entire selves in the context of that provision. Disclosure. The second theme that really jumps out to me is frontline managers. And again, I think this was in some of your papers there, Yana, and something that I think a lot about is that I think we know from many sources of evidence around what makes great workplaces that the relationship between someone and their immediate manager is almost always the most critical relationship in the workplace. Yeah, it's one of the most important places. You get that right, then actually workers are more engaged, people are more satisfied, people stay longer, they're more productive. All of those things are incredibly important. You get that wrong, then you're in places where people are looking for other jobs, second guessing themselves, doing all of those things that actually mean that we've all had some of those experiences where we're not in a great place to work. I think a lot, I guess, as an organisational leader about how is it we equip our frontline managers to be able to have clear, open, curious, trusting conversations with the people that they are leading. I think there's real value in equipping managers with things that we might call awareness or skills or knowledge. I think there's even greater value in making sure that our managers can have open, curious conversations where they don't need to have all the answers, but are able to kind of build a relationship with people that they are working with to understand what it means about what is happening in the workplace for their individuals. And that's right across the board, but I think is an incredibly helpful tool in the space of diversity, of inclusion, of belonging. And I guess I particularly think about that in the disability context. I guess one of the things that I have thought a lot about is that when you talk about accommodations for people who may have people who have disabilities, is that many of those accommodations are always deeply personal. They're deeply individual. Yeah, the thing that you might be doing to assist someone with a mobility problem works for one person, works differently for somebody else. And it seems to me that those things need to be grounded in really good conversations. Yeah, grounded conversations which say, what can you do? What actually works really well? What do you need a bit of assistance with? And, what might it be that actually we need to be adjusting, particularly then? They're very personal. I think it's only going to happen in the context of individual conversations. And I suspect that's particularly true for people with hidden disabilities, people who may be feeling a bit uncomfortable about talking about gender and sexual identity. I'm curious, Yana, in your research around all those people who did not disclose, about how many of them might identify, at least in their personal relationships, as people who are neurodiverse. I think there is a lot of neurodiversity. It's an emerging conversation here. I hope that in another 5 or 6 years, we're having a more sophisticated conversation about inclusion and diversity for people who identify as neurodiverse. because I think, there's lots of goodwill, lots of people having a crack at that. But interestingly, I think we've got a whole lot to learn in that space. I've got a whole lot to learn. Most of the organisations I know have a whole lot to learn, and I think we need to think that through. I did want to call out earlier that actually some of the data that we are seeing from our work in Pride and Diversity is actually starting to tell us that in the last couple of years, there's been some significant declines in the number of people who are out at work. It goes back to that disclosure point. So we have a pretty large survey of employees from organisations that we work with. I think it's about a 40,000 employee survey. What we're starting to see is reductions in the number of people from LGBT backgrounds who are willing to be out at work. And interestingly, when we talk to some of the CEOs and the leaders of those organisations, their hypothesis around that is that an increase in remote working has meant that people are not as exposed to the symbols which tell people that it's safe. Yeah, that tell people that this is an embracing organisation. Thanks, Annalise, for the correction of my language. I think I was just going a little bit off there. I really appreciate that. But I think that's a very interesting question, that as the nature of work changes, then the nature of our practice to signal the importance of inclusion also needs to change as well. And that we may be starting to see already some places where fewer LGBT people are being out in the workplace, which feels very odd to me in 2024. Last point, last reflection. I'm not timing myself, but Carla's going to give me a nod and tell me to shut up if I need to. I'm still okay, thank you. I'm not going to claim to be an academic economist of the skill and the history and the excellence that you're bringing to us, Yana. But economics is certainly partly a part of my history as well. And I think a bit about the importance right now of talking about the economic impacts of the work that we do. I share a few concerns right now. I'm also pretty damn concerned about what's going on for the trans and gender diverse community right now in our cultures, and how it is we create space to travel with trans and gender diverse people. And I'm pretty concerned about the backlash that's happening at the moment around diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. I guess and I'm sure there's lots of people on the call. I don't think you'd all be here on a call at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, our time, if you weren't also deeply committed to all of those issues. My view is there's always been two reasons why we give a damn about diversity and inclusion. One's been a human rights agenda. Yeah, it's the right thing to do. It's about being a decent human being. And that's a pretty strong motivator, I think, probably for most of the people, if not all of the people on the call, and for many people who are like us. And I think we should stick with it. It's worth doing. It's absolutely worth defending. But there was always a second agenda as well, which was actually a little more economic and a little bit more about the business case. So we actually know that health services that are less stigmatizing are more effective and cheaper. They're better for the people who use them, and they're better for the people who fund them. Yeah, we know that organisations that do a really good job about making it possible for everybody to be whole people in their workplace work better. It's not just the kind of macroeconomic numbers that Yana have been giving us. There's plenty of case study here around actually workplaces are more profitable, more effective, more efficient if they do well at this. And I really think at the moment we've got a political challenge, which is how to maintain what I think is a consensus across a majority of the community, not all of us, but a majority of the community, that we need to hold, that doing great work on belonging, on inclusion, on allowing people to be their whole selves in all of the spaces where we move, whether that's as consumers, as employees, as members of community, actually is better on a range of economic measures, on a range of kind of things you can convert into numbers, as well as because it's a decent thing to protect people's human rights. And I think for those of us who are advocates in this area, my suggestion would be that in the next while, we probably might need to remember to tell both sides of that story. Yeah, it's going to be important to be talking and generating the evidence, which is about some of those economic arguments, because I do think that's how we keep holding the centre. That's how we keep holding keeping that coalition of people who are motivated to do this work for different reasons, but are all committed to the same work. Yeah, we've got to hold that together. And I think if we can find those big stories and small about how this is both better for people, but better for the economics and the operation of our organisations, then I think we stand a chance of protecting, enhancing, and improving some really vital work for our communities. Carla, thanks for the invitation, and Eleanor, thank you for organising. Yana, a delight to be speaking with you. Really happy to participate in any questions or comments that come next.
Thank you both so much. And you'll see from the chat, there's a fantastic discussion going on with people connecting the points you've raised and the expertise they bring from their various perspectives. Thanks everybody for engaging so much in such a detailed, deep way. We do have a couple of questions. Eleanor, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I think there was a question from James, who I can see on camera. James, did you want to ask your question of Yana directly?
Thanks, Yana. Thanks, Michael, and thanks so much for hosting everybody. Really interesting chat as well. I think that macroeconomic benefits are really interesting, and we're lucky in New South Wales Health and in NSLHD that we've had some resourcing available to stand up some of the systems and processes that you've identified as working around disability inclusion and a workplace adjustments procedure. I was interested in the evidence that governments have shared that benefit back with organisations. Have you seen any reinvestment of those macroeconomic benefits back into inclusion? Is that what we're seeing with state government support for inclusion processes? And I know that those GDP benefits were primarily in the LGBTQI space. Obviously, we've had really significant national reforms on disability inclusion over the past couple of years, but we still struggle on a practical sense to find the financial resources to be as inclusive as we'd like to be. And my experience is predominantly in the disability space.
There has not been any direct reinvestment of these kind of economic gains. I think the challenge is to get governments to and policymakers to believe that there are these gains from national policies. Where I am encouraged is some of the work being done by the World Bank, in this area of LGBTQ inclusion. The bank has been collecting data on interventions and policies that work and providing support for more research on this area and encouraging countries to be more inclusive and to have these kind of policies. But in terms of, return on investment and having, these kind of GDP gains being plowed back into DEI initiatives, I don't see that happening directly, but I do believe strongly, that is the goal or the objective of, researchers like me, is to provide this kind of evidence, of such gains so that governments can have evidence-based policy reforms, and I believe that that's what the World Bank is pushing. And they are also doing work on the disability side and trying to encourage countries to have more accessibility and, these kind of accommodations. So I mentioned that as an example of where the scholarship, I think, is influencing policy through the mediation of some of these multilaterals like the World Bank.
James, my jump in on that one would be we've got to be a bit careful when we talk about reinvestment, because sometimes, and I think the useful way to use reinvestment is, where would we be without this work? Yeah, particularly in the healthcare setting, where you will always have increasing levels of demand coming into your services one way or another. Yeah, so I spend a bit of time working in health as well. given population growth, given increasing health needs of our communities, the likelihood of a project which actually delivers better healthcare resulting in a bed closing is incredibly unlikely. But it may mean you don't need to build as many new ones. And that avoided cost is real. Yeah, so, you know, what are the challenges for the health system? And I speak in beds because I'm sure, James, you're nodding. I'm sure that's a language that you use all the time in health. It's not just the bed, it's all the services that sit around it. If we can avoid future cost by working better, and I do believe providing more effective healthcare, yeah, for numbers of groups of people in our community, means that we spend less on emergency and, you know, horrible things that people would frankly prefer not to have to spend money on, then that's the reinvestment argument I'd suggest you push, not the, you know, we spend $2 million on this now and we think we can get that down to 1.8. It's actually going to be spending $3 million on that in 2 years' time. Yeah, and can I get that down to 2.8?
Thanks, Yana. Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. I just want to also flag that there's been some really amazing discussion in the chat that we might not get to now, but just things around the challenges with what language to use, that there are many different people who have different preferences, which highlights the importance of always including people with lived and living experience to ensure that, you know, we are responding to their preferences. But also lots of comments around people's specific lived and living experiences of disability and of stigma in the chat as well. There is a question in there which I might open to both Michael and Yana, which is, how do we get people to back up their espoused values with day-to-day actions or policies? Lots of people say they aren't ableist and say they're inclusive, but their actions demonstrate otherwise.
I don't know, Michael, do you want to go first? Your response may spark some ideas for me. Stories and relationships, I think, would be the things that I think are most powerful. Yeah, so I do think there are a lot of, it's going to sound this, please, my language is going to be a bit sloppy here. I think there are often a lot of well-intentioned, good people who lack imagination for elements of human experience. Yeah. I think of this in the example of people's experience of racism. Yeah. So when I work with a lot of people who do not personally experience racism are horrified to hear that there is racism in their workplaces. Now, I'm sure any people of colour, any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people we have on their call will be, you know, saying, well, of course there is racism in our workplaces. But I guess the insight I draw from that is that some of those people actually don't have imagination for the specific experience. So they're not seeing in their workplace incredibly overt racial prejudice, but they don't have an imagination for the experiences of racism, often small, often sustained, incredibly regular, that in fact staff are experiencing. Why do I say that? I think providing some of those examples, telling some of those stories actually helps convert goodwill into something which is a bit more real. I suspect that is absolutely true in the disability space. I think it's definitely true for trans and gender diverse people. Now, maybe, you know, old gay men like me are more common than we used to be, and people have more imagination for that than they used to. But I do think something about stories is useful, and if that can be grounded in some of the relationships that I was kind of talking about before, where it's possible for people to be honest and open about their own experience, not in ways that puts ludicrous educative burden on people, but is a genuine human relationship, then we also build capability. I think that's a partial answer. Good. And yeah, building on that wonderful answer, thank you, Michael. I think in the workplace, and I hope this answers the question too, what we're finding is that many of these interventions that I talked about and accommodations help everybody. You know, those who are heterosexual, cisgender, those who are able-bodied people. Our research is showing that everybody gains from some of these interventions. And I think if we can think of accommodations as helping everybody, some more than others, I think that would bring on board individuals who may be less open-minded than they claim they are. I think one of the best examples is probably working from home during the pandemic. This is an accommodation that can especially help individuals with mental health impairments and challenges. But during the pandemic, it became common. It became the norm for many people, not everyone, to work from home. And in our research, we called that an unintentional accommodation. Sometimes employers were helping neurodivergent individuals and they didn't even know it, because working from home kind of became the norm and many people benefited from it. So I think to answer that question, having more people come on board and being more inclusive in talking the talk and walking the walk is having workplaces that have accommodations, that have these kind of inclusion policies where it turns out that everybody gains, and having an awareness that everyone is gaining will help.
Thanks, Yana. And just to note in support of that point about the importance of storytelling and inclusion of people with lived and living experience, the research overwhelmingly backs this up, that that's beneficial both for people with lived and living experience to have those opportunities to tell their stories, but also for health workers, for instance, in changing their sort of attitudes and misconceptions that they have towards stigmatized groups of people. But also just to note that this conversation is really relevant at the moment in Australia in terms of, making accommodations, letting people work from home, because there is a massive push to get people to return to the office. So it's really useful to have this conversation. Carla, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just to pick up on that, pick up on that last point. There's a really interesting issue raised from SJ in the chat about wanting to talk about how disability intersects at the macro level with other marginalisations. And, this was part of the reason to put this session together, is try to bring these intersections together for us so that we're better equipped to pick up research or advocacy from other sectors and use it in our own. But I wanted to ask Yana and Michael, and this might be our ending point actually, about how do we speak about these intersections at the macro level of all the areas that we might be interested in and we might be touched on. How do we think about how these intersections of marginalisation, as SJ says, manifest in government policy and institutional workplace settings? Just an easy one to finish off with, no problems.
I'm giving that one to you, Yana, to start with, I think.
How do these intersections, I think a lot of it starts with awareness that we cannot just have, groups like this where we're all on board. We need to promote awareness among individuals who are voting for elected officials who make our policy, and for folks outside of, these kind of groups that we're sharing right now, to be more aware of the difficulties faced by people with intersecting identities that are marginalized, and for people to be aware of just how difficult that is, the challenges they face, and the need for interventions that can reduce these kind of stigmas. So I think it all starts with awareness. And I believe, that's part of my job and the job of many of you on this call, is promoting that awareness with our work. So I would start with that, and using different platforms to educate, to inform, to advocate, whether that be social media or writing op-eds or starting blogs or the podcasts that you're doing, exercising our voices in order to promote that awareness. So I would start with that as an answer to your question, Carla.
Thanks, Yana. Michael?
I think I've only got a half answer, Carla, but I think one of the tricky things we sometimes need to balance is how do we ensure we're creating space for the specific experiences that we're talking about, which are unique in, lots of diversity, and we want to understand deeply, and also understand where common responses can actually create a better culture and climate for many, many people. So it's one of the reasons I go back to that frontline relationship question. Yeah. Now, particularly in a small organization, I'm not sure that I can make every frontline manager an expert in every area of diversity and inclusion, but I probably can get them to be really good at having curious, open conversations, which minimize the burden on people to have to educate others, but actually allow people to be in a trusting relationship where we can do good work to actually create a positive workplace for those as individuals. Yeah. And I do think there are some things here that we run the risk of doing ourselves a disservice if we cut this stuff too finely and cut and dice this into too many pieces. It becomes too hard to digest. Actually, there are some core skills here about working well with diversity and with difference, yeah, about respecting other people, about building relationships in our workplaces, in our healthcare settings, that will help people, help create more inclusive environments for all people. And perhaps as a final, I think there's something we might want to keep thinking about sort of Yana's point. Actually, DEI is for everybody. This kind of work, reducing stigma, is for everybody. Whether you know it yet or not, you're going to experience this at some point in your life. You're going to need accommodation at some point in your life. It may not be due to one of the stories that is regularly told. It might be because of caring responsibilities. It might be, because of stuff that is related to our life as our aging. What are the accommodations I enjoy? Most of them are because I'm a parent, maybe because I'm a gay man, many other things that are sources of my identity. They're all ways in which we adapt and are reflexive in the way in which we work, in which we live, in which we consume services to try and get the outcome that we're all trying to shoot for. This isn't special work. This is human work for everybody.
Excellent. This is a special work for everybody. Thank you. We're 1 minute over time. These discussions, as always, could go on forever. I know people have had to jump off already. So thank you, Yana. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to our team and to everyone for participating so fully and with such passion and expertise. We really appreciate learning from everybody. So again, thank you, Yana and Michael, and have a good day, everybody.